Good morning. Today I thought it would make a nice change for me to talk to you rather than you have to read something in your inbox. And I'm going to talk about something which is close to my heart and very often misunderstood when I talk about it in public, because a lot of people believe that I criticize capitalism in terms of the way it's practiced and automatically, therefore, condemn every aspect of capitalism, which is not true at all. So I want to talk a little bit about the impacts that our thinking is having on how we deal with an emergency like the climate breakdown. And I want to give you an example of why I'm concerned with the way we think. When I was consulting, the corporate ideology of doing more with less never quite made sense to me. I wasn't quite sure why. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it didn't add up. Now I think I know better. Let me explain why. The manner in which the human brain sorts information in order to classify and make sense of its ambient conditions and context are not, as the philosopher Immanuel Kant observed, the thing in itself. Rather, they only depict maps of our perceptions of the reality of the world rather than the real thing. This is why we habitually put things in boxes. Compartmentalization is an obvious, easy, and effective way of sorting through ideas and labeling things. It honestly helps to make life intelligible and to impose order on things that might otherwise remain incomprehensible. But it does mean we tend to treat these boxes as being discrete from one another. We even continue to configure our organisations accordingly, in silos, in different departments. Same with government. That can mean we miss vital connections, which, in a world of complexity, uncertainty, ambiguity, volatility, and continuous flux, which our world is risky to say the least. So scientists, politicians, and the media have created a box called climate, where they discuss the climate crisis. They have other boxes too, such as pollution, desertification, soil erosion, overfishing, which, by the way, they largely ignore. Each box contains important aspects of a physical crisis. They've decided to divide it up to make it more comprehensible. That physical crisis, which is the ecological breakdown of the planet's living systems, belongs to a higher order predicament that we actually are choosing to ignore. This is a behavioural crisis regarding industrial methods of production and consumption and its impacts. This way of thinking about our situation is both reductionist and linear. That's fine in a stable world where hardly anything changes, and it's possible to predict that what was done yesterday will probably continue tomorrow, much as before. It's predictable, in other words. It's a predictable world. But reductionist and linear thinking don't work so well when faced with complex and uncertain phenomena. They're especially problematic when dealing with nature, which doesn't put things into arbitrary boxes, and everything is interconnected. As planetary systems are assailed by everything at once, each source of stress, of pressure, simply compounds the others. I want to give you an example, and I'm going to take the case of the North Atlantic right whale, whose population recovered a little when whaling ceased, but is now slumping again. The immediate reasons for this decline today are mostly deaths and injuries caused when whales are hit by ships or become tangled up in fishing gear. But they've become more vulnerable to these impacts because they've had to shift along the eastern seaboard of North America into very busy maritime waters. Their main prey, which is a small swimming crustacean called Colanus finmarchicus, is moving north at a rate of 8 kilometres a year because the sea is heating and they're after cooler waters. At the same time, a commercial fishing industry has developed, exploiting Colanus for the fish oil supplements we falsely believe to be beneficial to our health. There's been no attempt to assess the possible impacts from fishing Colanus. We also have absolutely no idea what the effects of ocean acidification, also caused by rising levels of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane, might be on this and many other species. As the death rate of the North Atlantic right whales rises, their birth rate is falling. Why? We can't be sure. Perhaps because of the pollutants accumulating in their bodies, some of which are likely to reduce fertility. Or perhaps because of ocean noise from boat engines, sonar, and oil and gas exploration, which may stress them and disrupt their communication. So you might call the decline of the North Atlantic right whale a shipping crisis, or you might look at it a different way as a climate crisis, or as an acidification crisis, or a pollution crisis, or even a noise crisis. It is in fact all of these things fitting into no single box. It's a general crisis caused by uncritical and unconstrained human activity. What would we see differently if we could break down our conceptual barriers, to stop putting things in separate boxes and to actually start looking at the whole and the dynamics of the interactions between things? Well, we would see a full spectrum assault on the living world, on nature. Scarcely anywhere is now safe from this sustained onslaught. A recent scientific paper in an online journal called Frontiers estimates that only 3% of the Earth's land surface should now be considered ecologically intact. These various impacts have a common cause, and it's the sheer volume of economic activity. We are doing too much of almost everything, and the world's living systems can't cope. But our failure to see the whole picture ensures that we fail to address this crisis systemically and effectively. When we box up predicaments like this, even well-intentioned efforts to solve one aspect of the underlying crisis exacerbate others. It's why we can't even be sure that green technologies will not generate unforeseen and unwanted impacts, making things worse overall. We cannot assume that simply because these are green, it's going to be okay. The other factor is, in terms of economics, everywhere governments seek to ramp up the economy. They're trying to increase GDP. They talk of resetting global capitalism, of unleashing our potential, and supercharging our economy. Just last week, I believe, Boris Johnson in the Parliament in the UK insisted that, and I quote, "a global recovery from the pandemic must be rooted in green growth." But there can be no such thing as green growth when growth is wiping green from the earth. The only crisis capable of destroying humanity is not the climate breakdown in itself, but our inability to connect the dots and to apply the only strategy that really makes comprehensive, unifying sense. That is a radical reduction of production and consumption by doing less of almost everything. That's heresy, of course. It's, if you like, secular blasphemy, which is why it is so difficult when I talk about the problems inherent within capitalism that people jump to the wrong conclusions. But we must do something, and doing much more with less is certainly not the solution. I hope you enjoyed the fact that I was reading this to you today and talking to you directly, rather than you having to read what I write.